Morgan Blake. Entry number 008. The Witch's Lair. In the deep woods, the line between myth and reality blurs. What if I told you that some mysteries are better left unsolved, that some doors, once opened, can never be closed? What if the stories we dismiss as myths or legends are simply truths waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves? Stay with me until the end, and you'll see why I had no choice but to believe in the impossible. I'm Morgan Blake, and this is the story of the Witch's Cabin. It began with whispers in a small rural town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and secrets are hard to keep. But this secret, the one about the disappearances near the forest, was something no one could quite explain. The locals talked about it in hushed tones, their eyes darting to the edge of the woods as if something might be watching. The missing people had all been last seen near the dense forest that bordered the town, a forest that seemed to swallow them whole. No one who entered the woods ever returned, and the few who dared to venture close spoke of a feeling, a presence, that sent shivers down their spines. The townspeople believed in the old stories, the ones about a witch who lived deep in the forest, in a cabin that was impossible to find unless it wanted to be found. They said she took those who strayed too close, using their souls to fuel her dark magic. Of course, I didn't believe any of it, at least, not at first. But something about the case intrigued me, something that made me feel like there was more to the story than met the eye. The town's mayor had contacted me, desperate for someone to solve the mystery and bring an end to the fear that gripped his community. He was a practical man, not prone to superstition, and he believed there had to be a logical explanation for the disappearances. But as I listened to him, I could see the doubt in his eyes, the way his voice faltered when he spoke about the forest. It was enough to make me wonder if, perhaps, there was something more to this than just folklore. In town on a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air is cool and the leaves crunch underfoot. The town was small, with narrow streets and old buildings that seemed to lean in toward each other, as if sharing secrets. The people watched me as I walked through the town square, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. I spent the first day interviewing the families of the missing, trying to piece together a pattern. There wasn't much to go on, no signs of struggle, no clues left behind, just the sudden disappearance of people who had been perfectly fine moments before. The only thing they all had in common was that they had been near the forest. One woman, Mrs. Kearns, had lost her husband. She was an elderly lady, frail with grief, who spoke in a trembling voice about the day he vanished. He'd been chopping wood at the edge of the forest, a task he'd done countless times before. But that day, he didn't return. When she went to look for him, she found the axe embedded in a tree stump, the logs he'd cut neatly stacked, but no sign of him. "It's like he just disappeared," she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. "He loved those woods, but that day, they took him." Another man, Mr. Avery, told me about his teenage daughter, Sarah. She had been adventurous, always exploring the woods despite the warnings. He had forbidden her from going too deep, but teenagers rarely listened to such advice. One afternoon, she went out and didn't come back. They found her bicycle near the entrance to a trail that led into the heart of the forest, but nothing else. "It's those woods," he said with a shake of his head. "They're cursed. Something in there took my little girl." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I made my way to the edge of the woods. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. There was something unsettling about the place, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I was alone. I found a path leading into the forest, narrow and overgrown, as if it hadn't been used in years. The ground was soft, covered in a thick layer of leaves, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. As I stepped onto the path, I felt a chill run through me, as if the forest itself was warning me to turn back. But I didn't. I couldn't. I had to know what was hiding in those woods. The deeper I went, the darker it became. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out the light. The path twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the heart of the forest. I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were closing in on me, that the forest was alive, watching my every move. The sound of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, each crunch of leaves echoing through the trees. I was about a mile in when I first heard it, a faint whisper, carried on the wind. I stopped, straining to hear, but the sound was gone. I told myself it was just the wind in the trees, but deep down, I knew it was something else. I pressed on, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest seemed to grow darker with each step, the shadows deepening until it was hard to see the path ahead. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, the sense of something ancient and malevolent lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a flicker of movement, a shadow darting between the trees. I turned, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, standing silent and still. I was about to continue when I saw it, a faint light, flickering through the trees. It was far off, barely visible through the dense undergrowth, but it was there, a single point of light in the darkness. I knew, without a doubt, that it was the cabin. The story said that the cabin only appeared to those who were meant to find it, that it could only be found if the witch allowed it. I didn't believe in witches, but as I stood there, staring at the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led somewhere, that the forest was guiding me towards something it wanted me to see. As I made my way through the forest, the light growing brighter with each step, the air grew colder. I could see my breath misting in the air, despite the fact that it wasn't winter. The trees, once merely imposing, now seemed to twist and contort as if they were alive, their branches curling inward like claws. The undergrowth thickened, branches tugging at my clothes, leaves rustling underfoot as though the forest itself were trying to slow my progress. At one point, I heard a low, guttural growl, barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. I stopped, heart racing, and strained my ears. The growl came again, closer this time, reverberating through the trees. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I swept the beam across the forest floor, searching for the source of the sound. Nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the forest, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I knew better. The forest was alive, aware, and it didn't want me there. I took another step forward, then another, and the growling stopped. In its place came a different sound, a soft, melodic humming, almost like a lullaby. The notes hung in the air, soothing and yet somehow unsettling, like a memory you can't quite place. It was coming from the direction of the cabin, and despite my fear, I felt a strange compulsion to follow it. The light ahead grew brighter still, and I found myself standing at the edge of a clearing. The trees parted like a curtain, revealing the cabin in the center. It was exactly as the stories described, old, weathered wood, a sagging roof, windows that stared out like empty eyes. But there was something more, something the stories hadn't mentioned. The cabin wasn't just surrounded by trees, it was entwined with them. The branches of the surrounding trees twisted around the cabin like serpents, their roots burrowing into the ground around it. The wood of the cabin seemed to blend with the trees, as if the forest itself had claimed the structure as its own. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a pull, like an invisible hand drawing me closer. I took a step forward, then stopped. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But I couldn't. The cabin called to me, the melody wrapping around my mind like a vice, urging me to take just one more step. I pushed the door open slowly, the wood creaking in protest. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and decay, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. I reached for my flashlight, flicking it on and sweeping the beam across the room. The cabin was small, just a single room with a dirt floor and walls made of rough-hewn logs. In the center of the room was a table, covered in a thick layer of dust. On the table sat a book, its cover worn and faded, and beside it, a candle burned with a weak, flickering flame. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled by the dirt floor. The cabin was eerily silent, the only sound the faint crackle of the candle's flame. I approached the table, my eyes fixed on the book. There was something about it that drew me in, something that made my skin crawl with a deep, primal fear. I reached out and touched the cover, feeling the rough texture of the leather under my fingers. It was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been, as if the book itself was somehow alive. I hesitated, then slowly opened it. The pages were filled with strange symbols, written in a language I didn't recognize. The ink was dark, almost black, and the symbols seemed to writhe and twist on the page as I stared at them. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, a sense of dread that tightened my chest and made it hard to breathe. I turned the pages slowly, each one filled with more of the strange symbols. And then, on the last page, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a drawing, a crude sketch of a figure standing in the forest, surrounded by trees. The figure was tall and thin, with long, spindly arms and fingers that ended in sharp claws. Its face was obscured, but its eyes were large and black, filled with a malevolent intelligence. I stared at the drawing, my heart pounding in my chest. It was as if the figure was staring back at me, watching me with those cold, black eyes. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling. I knew, without a doubt, that the figure in the drawing was real, that it was the thing that had been watching me in the forest. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard something behind me, a soft rustling, like the sound of leaves being disturbed. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. I backed toward the door, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. And then I saw it, a shadow, shifting in the corner of the room. It was there for only a moment, but I saw it clearly, the long, spindly arms and the cold, black eyes. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I turned and ran, bursting out of the cabin and into the forest. The trees closed in around me as I ran, their branches clawing at my clothes, but I didn't stop. I could feel the presence behind me, following me, chasing me through the woods. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get out of the forest, had to get away from whatever was chasing me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed through the undergrowth, my heart pounding in my chest. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my feet slipping on the damp leaves. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The forest seemed to go on forever, the trees all looking the same, and I had no idea how to find my way out. At one point, I thought I saw a light ahead and felt a surge of hope. I ran toward it, only to find myself standing before the cabin once more. I had circled back. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, I was trapped. The forest wouldn't let me leave. Desperation clawed at my mind as I tried to retrace my steps, to find the path I had taken into the forest. But every direction I turned led me back to the cabin. It was as if the forest were playing a cruel game, toying with me, leading me in circles until I would collapse from exhaustion. The shadows around me seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. I could hear the rustling again, closer this time, and the sound of soft footsteps, too light to belong to any animal. They were coming from all around me, closing in. And then I saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, their forms barely visible through the thick undergrowth. They moved silently, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I couldn't make out their features, but I could feel their gaze, cold and unfeeling, like the eyes of predators sizing up their prey. I turned and ran again, my heart pounding in my chest, but I knew it was futile. The forest had me now, and there was no escape. The branches tore at my clothes, the roots seemed to reach up from the ground, trying to trip me, to hold me down. My lungs burned with every breath, and my legs felt like lead. I could feel them behind me, hear the soft footfalls, the whispers that seemed to come from all around. They were getting closer, closing in. My vision blurred, and the world around me seemed to spin. The last thing I saw before I fell was the cabin, standing there like a sentinel, watching over the forest with its empty, black eyes. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, my body aching and my clothes torn. The forest was silent, the oppressive darkness replaced by the soft light of dawn filtering through the trees. I pushed myself up on shaky legs, my mind reeling with the events of the night before. I didn't know how long I had been unconscious or how I had survived. The figures, the whispers, the shadows, they were gone. But the cabin was still there, standing in the clearing, as if waiting for me. I felt a pull, a compulsion to return to the cabin, to open that door once more and face whatever lay inside. But I fought it. The terror of the night before was still fresh in my mind, the memory of those cold, black eyes still haunting my thoughts. I turned and stumbled away from the cabin, my steps slow and unsteady. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from that place, from the forest, from the things that lurked within it. The trees seemed to part for me this time, the undergrowth thinning as I made my way through the forest. The air was still cold, but the oppressive weight that had pressed down on me was gone. The forest was no longer alive, no longer watching me. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the edge of the forest. The trees gave way to open fields, and I could see the town in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by the knowledge of what lay behind me, hidden in the depths of the woods. I didn't stop running until I was back in the town square, my lungs burning and my legs shaking with fatigue. I collapsed onto a bench, gasping for air, my mind racing with what I had just seen. The townspeople stared at me as they passed, their eyes filled with curiosity and fear. I knew I must have looked like a madman, disheveled and wild-eyed, but I didn't care. I had made it out of the forest alive, and that was all that mattered. I spent the next few days trying to piece together what had happened, but the memories were like fragments of a nightmare, disjointed and hazy. The only thing I knew for certain was that the cabin was real, and so was the thing inside it. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen, not even the mayor. I didn't think he would believe me, and even if he did, what could he do? The forest was still there, and so was the cabin. And I knew that whatever was inside it was still watching, still waiting. I left town a few days later, but the memories of the forest stayed with me. I could still feel the weight of the trees pressing down on me, the sense of something ancient and evil lurking just out of sight. And sometimes, late at night, I would hear a faint whisper, carried on the wind, and I would remember the eyes watching me from the darkness. Years passed, and the memories of the witch's cabin faded, but they never truly left me. I continued my work, investigating the strange and unexplained, but I never returned to that town, and I never spoke of what I had seen in the forest. But the past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how fast you run. One day, out of the blue, I received a letter from the town's mayor. He was an old man now, nearing the end of his life, and he wanted to confess something to me. I went to see him, and he told me a story that chilled me to the bone. He told me that he had known about the cabin, that he had known what was inside it, and that he had sent me into the forest to confront it, hoping that I would be able to put an end to the evil that haunted his town. But he had been wrong. The evil wasn't something that could be defeated, he said. It was ancient, older than the town itself, older than the forest. It had been there long before the first settlers arrived, and it would be there long after they were gone. The cabin was a doorway, he told me, a portal to a place where the lines between the living and the dead, between myth and reality, blurred. And the thing inside it was the guardian, the keeper of the doorway, ensuring that the evil stayed contained. But sometimes, he said, the door would open, just a crack, and the evil would seep out into the world, taking those who were foolish enough to stray too close. He told me that he had sent me into the forest because he had hoped I would be able to close the door, to seal the evil away for good. But all I had done was awaken it, draw its attention. The mayor died not long after our conversation, and I was left with the knowledge that the evil in the forest was still there, still watching, still waiting. And that's where the story ends, for now. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not truly over, that the evil is still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. So if you ever find yourself near a dark forest, remember this story, and stay away from the shadows. Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Morgan Blake. End of entry.